Pathetic, old man. That thing on your arm looks nothing more than a joke. The insult tore through the quiet afternoon at Coronado Base. 3 towering SEAL recruits circled around an elderly gardener, mocking the faded tattoo on his arm. In their eyes, it was weakness misplaced, meaningless. Yet they could never have imagined that the hunched man before them had once walked through war, through rivers of fire and shadows. In just a few moments, the arrogance of youth would shatter, giving way to a truth powerful enough to shake the entire base. Amid rows of marigolds, an old man with silver hair knelt, tending carefully to each plant. His name was Samuel Walker, 86 years old. He wore no uniform, no gleaming medals, only a faded shirt, soil-stained gloves, and a simplicity so ordinary it was easy to forget. To the young men, he was nothing more than an elderly gardener, present only to sweep leaves and turn soil to make the grounds look neat. But what drew their attention was not the spade in his hand, but the left arm revealed when he rolled up his sleeve. There, etched faintly, was a tattoo so faded and time-worn it was nearly unrecognizable, a crude-looking frog clutching a trident. To a generation of recruits accustomed to tattoos of eagles, anchors, or sharp-edged mottos, that symbol looked like nothing but a joke. One recruit stepped forward, arrogance blazing across his face, jabbing a finger at the tattoo. He burst out laughing, pulling his comrades in to join. "Did you get drunk in Mexico and let someone draw that on you? A tadpole with a fork? Pathetic." Laughter erupted, sharp as tiny knives, ripping apart the quiet afternoon of the base. A few sailors and civilian staff paused to watch. Some chuckled along, others frowned, sensing the ridicule had crossed the line. But not one person intervened. In the center of the mockery, Sam Walker remained silent. His hands trembled with age, yet stayed steady as they pressed soil around a flower. His face was indifferent, as if the noise had nothing to do with him. No reaction, no resistance, no anger. His calmness, rather than cooling the recruits, only fueled their aggression. To arrogant youth, silence meant weakness, and weakness meant permission to humiliate. The atmosphere quickly turned into a performance. The recruits stood tall, flexing muscles and confidence, while the old man sat small and solitary. To them, it was just a moment of amusement after exhausting drills, a laugh to prove their superiority. They had no idea that his silence concealed a past forged in steel, a history beyond their imagination. A few eyes in the crowd began to shift. Those who had served longer felt uneasy. That tattoo, though faded and crude, was not one they commonly saw. It hinted at something, a symbol remembered from seldom read pages of history. But before recognition could come, the jeers rang louder, drowning out every thought. Sam Walker, the man they dismissed, was no ordinary gardener. That tattoo was no joke. It was the mark of an earlier generation of special operators, a legacy the very SEAL recruits mocking him now were following. And in just a few more minutes, when the truth was revealed, the entire Coronado base would fall silent. All right, dear viewers, take a few seconds to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly resonate with what I'm sharing. And leave a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see friends joining us from all around the world. The mocking laughter still echoed, but in a fleeting moment, Sam Walker's eyes shifted ever so slightly. No one noticed the detail except for a few who had served long enough. They had seen that look before, not the gaze of a harmless old man, but of someone who had survived places where courage and silence determined who lived and who didn't. The finger of recruit Peterson pressed hard against the tattoo. That pressure seemed to unlock a door of memory inside Sam's mind. He no longer heard the jeers around him. Instead, came the familiar sounds. The droning buzz of insects in the jungle, the pungent smell of swampy mud, the salty sting of river water seeping into wounds yet to heal. It all rushed back so vividly he felt as if he had returned to decades earlier, where young men bore an oath of life and death. Sam remembered the leaky hut on the banks of the Mekong in 1968. Three young soldiers huddled under the light of an oil lamp, trembling in the monsoon storm, clenching their jaws against the fear of enemies lurking in the dark. There was no sterile ink, no professional studio, only gun soot, a splash of whiskey, and the trembling yet steady hand of a comrade. They had carved onto their skin the image of a frog clutching a trident. Not for display, not for vanity. It was a vow: go where no one dares to go and return together. Back in the present, Sam's lips curled ever so slightly. A smile nearly invisible, at once bitter and tender. There was humor in it, for it was almost absurd that the young men before him thought they were mocking a feeble old man when in truth, that very tattoo had once struck fear into enemies. If only they knew, they would wish they had chosen another target for their jokes. The crowd continued watching. A few seasoned sailors exchanged glances, minds stirring with dusty memories from Naval Archives records that spoke of the Delta Frogmen, a unit that existed only in legend. None could be certain, but the faint familiarity of the symbol forced their expressions into sudden sobriety. Meanwhile, Peterson grew more aggressive. He yanked Sam's worn canvas bag, rummaging as if searching for proof of his insignificance. Out came a faded thermos, a pair of gloves, a few scattered tools. The laughter rose again. Someone sneered, "What? You drink prune juice to keep yourself alive?" The cheap humor mixed with roughness made the crowd roar, though some frowned now, sensing this had gone too far. Sam did not react. He simply looked on, his gaze calm yet fathomless, as though observing a battle the other had already lost without knowing it. He understood the nature of arrogance. It often collapses on itself. His years of war had taught him that the loudest man in the room was rarely the strongest. What unsettled the crowd was not only his silence but the weight carried in his every small gesture. The way he neatly folded his gloves, set the spade aside, each movement slow, deliberate, without wasted energy. These were not the habits of an ordinary gardener. They were the economy of motion of someone who had survived where a needless move could cost a life. On the edge of the gathering, a young petty officer broke into a cold sweat. He realized he had seen the frog and trident symbol once before in a classified SEAL history document. He could not be certain, but instinct froze him in place. Impossible, he thought. Yet, when his eyes met Sam's, the doubt only grew heavier. As Peterson tried harder to provoke laughter, one question lingered, unanswered. Why was this old man, who could so easily be crushed by youthful strength, so utterly unshaken? Why was there not a trace of fear in those pale blue eyes? Perhaps it was this very silence, this unspoken patience that would soon leave the entire base in stunned disbelief. Would those recruits realize in time that the faded tattoo they ridiculed was the very clue to a secret that could shake all of Coronado? Peterson's rough grip on the faded tattoo was more than an insult. It was as if an invisible switch had been flipped, opening a door Samuel Walker had locked shut for decades. In an instant, the jeering faded away, replaced by the hum of tropical nights, the ceaseless whine of mosquitoes, the quickened breaths of comrades hidden in the dark. He was once more inside the cramped hull of a PBR boat, the engine's growl blending with the slapping river water, moonlight rippling across the Mekong. The smell of engine oil mingled with mud and gunpowder, creating a scent he could never forget. Beside him, a younger teammate hissed, "Sam, the wind's shifting. If we don't turn now, they'll hear us." Every word was like a knife, not out of anger, but because each carried the weight of life and death. That feeling perched on the knife's edge of survival, silent as stone while the world threatened to erupt, was the very thing present in Sam's eyes now. None of the recruits recognized it. All they saw was a stubborn old man, quiet and easy to mock. But those who understood, those who knew calm could be more terrifying than gunfire, were beginning to sense something was off. At the edge of the crowd stood a seasoned officer, Senior Chief Riggs. He did not laugh. His gaze was locked on the faded tattoo. As a trainee years ago, he had stumbled upon a dusty archival report no one cared to read. It spoke of an early band of frogmen, men whose missions were so secret official records denied their existence. Their hand-drawn symbol was crude, simple, a frog wielding a trident. Riggs swallowed hard. He could not believe it. The theory existed, yes, but no one expected to meet one of them in real life. Least of all here, in something as ordinary as a garden beside the barracks. But Sam's eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen too much, betrayed it all. Meanwhile, Peterson continued his act. He lifted Sam's battered thermos like a trophy. His buddies howled. "What's in here? Herbal tea? Orange juice for extra vitamins?" The cheap taunt drew laughter, but not from Riggs. His skin prickled. If his suspicion was right, that thermos had borne witness to more secrets than the Pentagon's classified vaults. Sam sat still, calloused hands resting on his knees. Memories flooded him. He remembered lying hidden under banana leaves for 3 days to avoid enemy helicopters. Remembered stitching a wound shut with a fishing hook and whiskey. Remembered the defiant grins of young faces who had sworn with him they would all return. That tattoo was no joke. It was a map drawn in blood and sweat, a reminder they had walked through hell and survived. A flicker of humor crossed Sam's mind. He thought, if these boys were forced to bury themselves in mud for 2 days, leeches crawling over their bodies, they'd be begging for their mothers long before mocking any tattoo. The thought made him smile, an almost invisible smile, but one that made Riggs's blood run cold. The crowd began to murmur. The old man's silence no longer felt like a joke. It had become something heavy, unsettling, slowing the air itself. The laughter faltered, trailing off. Only Peterson, blind to what he was provoking, continued as if toying with a harmless relic. Riggs slipped a hand into his pocket and drew out his phone. His pulse hammered as he dialed directly to the command office. His voice dropped, urgent. "I need to see Captain Thorne immediately. Tell him this is about Samuel Walker." The duty officer on the other end froze. A name like a hammer blow enough to chill the blood. Riggs glanced around, making sure no one overheard, then eased himself out of the crowd. He knew if he didn't act now, a disaster both foolish and shameful would unfold. Arrogant recruits mocking the very man who had laid the foundation for them all. Peterson still had hold of Sam's arm, tugging as if to pull an old man from a park bench. His friends still laughed, unaware that with each passing second, a storm of brass and uniforms was preparing to descend upon them. The entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath, though most didn't know why. They only felt something shifting, something vast, beyond the control of the laughter that had started it all. Dear viewers, take a sip of water and stay with the story. The most unexpected twists are still ahead. Comment 1 if you find this story compelling, so we know you're still here with us. The mocking laughter still lingered when another sound tore through the air, powerful and unfamiliar. The roar of engines, sharp and unrelenting, unlike any supply truck or routine patrol vehicle. Curious eyes snapped toward the main gate of Coronado Base. A convoy of black SUVs, their tinted windows gleaming, red and blue lights flashing, stormed into the courtyard with the urgency and precision reserved only for the highest level of emergencies. The crowd froze. Jeering smiles fell away like brittle leaves. A few recruits exchanged uneasy glances, bewildered. No one could fathom why such imposing vehicles had come barreling in, seemingly to intervene in what had appeared to be harmless mockery. Doors swung open. The sharp thud of leather shoes struck the pavement, each step deliberate, echoing like war drums. The first to emerge was Captain Jonathan Thorne, commander of the Naval Special Warfare Center. His dress whites caught the blaze of the afternoon sun, the golden eagle insignia on his collar glinting so brightly it made some blink. Behind him followed a line of senior staff officers, faces taut, eyes like blades sweeping the assembly. The air shifted instantly. Every whisper, every smirk, was devoured by a silence heavy enough to crush the lungs. Peterson, still clutching Sam's arm, suddenly felt as though he were holding live coals. He released it at once, his face blanching. Thorne advanced with strides sharp as knives cutting water. He neither glanced at the recruits nor at the onlookers. Every ounce of his focus, every flame in his eyes, was fixed on the elderly man sitting beside the rows of marigolds. When he was exactly 1 meter away, Thorne halted, stood tall, and performed a gesture that locked the entire base in stunned disbelief. A crisp, flawless salute, so sharp it seemed to tear the air itself. "Mr. Walker." His voice rang out clear, resonant, trembling not with command but with emotion. There was no anger, no order, only absolute respect. The crowd was struck dumb. The recruits could not comprehend it. An old gardener, being saluted, with the most formal military honor, by the base's highest-ranking commander? Their eyes darted frantically, seeking answers that did not exist. Holding his salute, Thorne spoke again, his words tolling like a bell that shattered all traces of ridicule. "Samuel Walker is not a gardener. He is one of the very first frogmen. Before the SEALs had an official name, he carried out missions the world never even knew existed. The tattoo you mocked is the original mark, crude, yes, but sacred, of the Delta Frogmen, the men who laid the foundation for all of us standing here today." The words struck the courtyard like a hammer blow. Breaths turned heavy. Some young sailors shivered, stepping back as though they had just seen a ghost step out from forgotten pages of history. Peterson's face burned with shame. He struggled to stand upright, but his legs quaked beneath him. The taunts he had shouted only minutes before now echoed in his head, slapping at his pride like open palms. Sam, however, remained seated. He lifted his gaze slightly toward Thorne, eyes touched with both surprise and gentleness. Like a man who had weathered countless storms only to find himself at the center of another. He exhaled softly, almost amused, that all this uproar stemmed from a tattoo they had once joked among themselves looked worse than a barracks doodle. The tension, coiled tight, broke. The senior officers standing behind Thorne snapped to attention, raising their hands in salute. The sight, an entire row of high-ranking officers saluting an old gardener among the flowers, was so solemn and surreal that had one not witnessed it, they would never believe it. And it was precisely that strangeness that etched it into memory forever. For the recruits, it was their first true shock of military life. They realized how gravely they had erred, mistaking humility for weakness, age for irrelevance. Sam nodded slightly. No arrogance, no overwhelming emotion, only a modest smile tinged with awkwardness. He had never sought this moment. His life had been lived in silence, in shadows, in doing what others would never know. But today, the truth had been uncovered. And once the truth is spoken, there is no turning back. But what would happen next? When Captain Thorne turned to face the very recruits who had just mocked a living legend. The air in the Coronado courtyard had grown so thick that every breath could be heard. After Captain Thorne's declaration, the three recruits, those who only minutes earlier had strutted with arrogance, now stood with heads bowed, their faces pale, stripped of every ounce of bravado. The crowd was silent, broken only by the steady rhythm of waves crashing offshore, striking each heart like a tolling bell of reckoning. In that moment, Samuel Walker, the man at the center of it all, remained seated on the earth, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his gaze unnervingly calm. He took no satisfaction in their humiliation, showed no pride in the sudden reverence. If anything had changed, it was only the faint weariness in the corners of his eyes, as though all this commotion was more than he had ever wished for. Thorn turned, his voice cold as steel, announcing that the files of the 3 recruits would be suspended pending his personal review. His words hung in the air like a sentence ready to crush the dreams they once carried. The crowd waited, holding its breath. Would Sam let the arrogant boys face punishment, or would he step forward to intervene? Slowly, Sam rose to his feet. His knees cracked like old timber, yet his posture was straight and unyielding. He stepped forward, placing his calloused hand gently on Captain Thorn's arm. The gesture was small, but it softened the entire atmosphere. Every eye turned to him, as though awaiting a verdict from the very legend they had only just discovered. He shook his head slightly. His eyes carried no blame, no anger, only profound understanding. For a fleeting second, he saw himself decades ago, a hot-headed young soldier, brash and defiant, believing the world existed to prove his strength. "They're just kids," his gaze seemed to say. That simple act eased the crushing tension. A few people exhaled. Faces flickered with surprise. Even Thorn, whose expression was usually carved from steel, gave a small nod, his eyes softening for a moment. The crowd stood awash in conflicting emotions. Many had expected vengeance, yet what they witnessed was forgiveness. Strangely, it stunned them more than the salute had. For this mercy was not weakness, it was strength. The strength of a man who had walked through hell, who understood that arrogance destroys itself, and who chose redemption over ruin. Peterson, the instigator, hung his head low. He felt a hand closing around his throat, not from punishment, but from the mercy of the man he had insulted. A raw, gnawing regret rose inside him, making him wish he could take back every word of mockery. Sam smiled faintly. In that tense moment, his smile carried a trace of gentle humor, as though mocking himself. Who would have thought that an ugly old tattoo could throw an entire base into chaos? A few officers chuckled softly, easing the stiffness. The heavy silence lifted, replaced by a warmth no one could quite describe. Then Sam turned to the other recruits, his gaze lingering on their bewildered young faces. He did not need to speak. The message was clear. Honor is not found in muscles or taunts, but in how one faces the truth. His silence, this time, was a lesson sharper than any drill sergeant's shout. That day at Coronado, all who were present knew they had witnessed a moment that would be remembered for years to come. Not because of the SUVs that stormed the courtyard, nor the crisp salute of Captain Thorn, but because an old man with silver hair had chosen forgiveness, turning ridicule into a living history lesson. For the 3 recruits, Thorn's punishment would likely still come. But more than that, they had already been humbled by the mercy of the man they had scorned. And that memory, painful though it was, would become the very fuel to change. Sam returned to his place by the marigolds, picking up his worn thermos. He unscrewed the lid, poured a little water into his palm, and let it fall gently onto a wilting flower. The gesture was simple, quiet, yet carried the weight of a symbol. A flower can live again with a drop of water, and a person can change with a single chance. The crowd watched in silence, yet inside each mind a thought echoed. Not everyone can forgive after being humiliated, but those who can, they are the truly strongest of all. So, what do you think will happen next? Take a moment to relax, and leave a comment, type 1 or "I'm still here," so we know you're with us on this journey. The courtyard of Coronado had never witnessed a scene like this. Even after Captain Thorn and his cadre of senior officers departed, the air still hung heavy, as if a storm had just swept through, leaving the sting of ozone lingering in its wake. The young sailors had yet to collect themselves. Each one realized they had just seen a moment of history, something that would be told and retold for years to come. Sam Walker sat back down beside the marigold rose, patiently pressing soft soil around the roots. He moved as though nothing remarkable had happened, as if the arrival of the convoy, the crisp salutes, or the suspended fate of 3 recruits were all matters outside his world. To him, the flowers still needed tending, and silence was still his chosen language. But to the younger sailors, that silence carried an uncommon weight. It became a mirror, reflecting their own recklessness back at them. The mocking grins from before had withered into shame. Heads bowed. No one dared meet the eyes of the old man they had so easily dismissed only minutes earlier. Peterson, his face burning red with humiliation, stood frozen like a statue. All the muscles that had carried him through brutal drills were useless now. What he faced was not a test of strength, but the hollow ache within his pride. He had laid hands on a legend not to learn, but to mock, and that regret would shadow him for years. The reaction of the onlookers was equally unexpected. Seasoned sailors, who once regarded Sam as part of the base's scenery, now shifted their demeanor. They stood straighter when passing his garden, some even offering him nods of respect as though saluting a superior. No proclamation was made, no ceremony performed, but the change was undeniable. From that day forward, Samuel Walker was no longer the old gardener. He was a living symbol the entire base would honor. In the command office, Thorne ordered a new module to be added to SEAL training, the history and legacy of naval special warfare. Not merely dates and battles, but the human stories the men who had quietly built the foundation. And in the very first lesson, Sam Walker's story was told. No glossy PowerPoint slides, just a few lines of text and a faded sketch of the Delta Frogman emblem. Yet for the recruits, it was like staring into a mirror, reminding them of the towering shadow they stood beneath. Back in the courtyard, Peterson finally moved. He stepped towards Sam, stopping at a respectful distance. No one could hear what he said, but all saw the tremor in his shoulders, the hands clenched tight as if holding back an apology. Sam did not answer with words. He simply nodded, then pulled a cold bottle of water from his thermos and handed it to Peterson. That small gesture, strangely enough, stirred the crowd more deeply than any speech could. Peterson accepted it, eyes red. He could not hold Sam's gaze for long, but the look he received carried no contempt, only forgiveness. And sometimes, forgiveness is the heaviest punishment of all, for it forces a man to confront his own failures and live better than before. In the days that followed, the base began to change in subtle but undeniable ways. Each time Sam walked by, young sailors paused their chatter, stood straighter, or offered a nod. Now and then, someone would joke, "Good morning, Mr. Walker. The flowers are looking beautiful today." Sam would simply smile in return, eyes alight with quiet joy. Curiously, it was the marigolds themselves that became the new symbol. People whispered about the Frogman's garden. The very recruits who had mocked him now volunteered to pull weeds and turn soil. Some joked they had never imagined a day where they'd swim 5 miles in training and then learn to care for flowers. But they did it because they knew every root carried the shadow of a man whose debt could never be repaid. In each heart, the lesson was carved deep. Honor is not in muscle, nor in the loudest voice. Honor is in silence when needed, patience under humiliation, and mercy when revenge is within reach. Samuel Walker had shown them all of this without delivering a single lecture. And at Coronado, a new legend was born, not of a secret mission or a brutal battle, but of an old man with silver hair, a faded tattoo, and a timeless lesson. Yet, the story did not end there. How far would that tattoo and the legacy of Sam Walker echo into the generations of SEALs yet to come? The story at Coronado did not end with a faded tattoo or a chaotic afternoon. It stands as proof that true strength does not lie in shouts or muscle, but in patience, humility, and the power of forgiveness. Samuel Walker taught the entire base and all of us that honor does not fade with time, and that values such as brotherhood, compassion, and mercy are the true foundations upon which a generation is built. In a world full of noise, sometimes the strongest force is calm, silence, and a heart that knows how to forgive. If a man who once walked out of the fiercest battlefields can still smile and forgive, then surely we can learn to be gentler with ourselves and with others. If this story has touched your heart, please press like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. What lesson did you take away from the journey of the old gardener with the legendary tattoo? Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next stories of America's unsung heroes.
Get out of this area, you don't belong here. Those words did not come from a drunken bigot, but from a police officer pointing his finger at a man who was merely sitting and reading a newspaper. No weapons, no shouting, no resistance. Yet because of his skin color, his age, and his silence, he was perceived as a threat. What happened next stunned the entire nation. For that man was not just a veteran. He had served as a Navy SEAL, saving 9 lives in Afghanistan, and now he was being dragged away from the very country he once defended. In Fort Collins, there are neighborhoods that seem lifted straight from an advertisement. Red brick sidewalks, a croissant bakery with a handwritten chalkboard sign, and houses behind immaculate white picket fences. Everything here is clean, bright, and appears to leave no room for mess. Jerome J.T. Thacker wasn't messy, but he didn't exactly fit that picture either. At 62, with dark skin and shoulders as broad as a wooden beam, he looked like driftwood washed up in a leather furniture showroom. Whenever he strolled down College Avenue, hands tucked in the pockets of his worn coat, gaze fixed straight ahead, people would stop not to greet him, but to stare. He caused no trouble, never did. JT didn't smoke, didn't shout, didn't beg. He simply appeared like a shadow at high noon in Colorado's silent, receding, arriving from nowhere and headed for who knows where. He lived in a dilapidated ground floor room near Riverside, where winter winds whistled through the cracks and summer sun beat down through the tin roof. The small room, its paint peeling, held only a battered armchair and an AM radio perpetually playing half-heard country music. No visitors came, no friends, no family, no one to talk with. Even the paper carrier left his newspaper at a distance, as if JT might conduct electricity, but he never complained. Perhaps he'd grown used to the world forgetting him, or perhaps he'd once lived somewhere you survived only by staying silent and disappearing. Locals called him the strange old man. Children warned one another to keep their distance. He's homeless or he's got issues. Police didn't use his name. They had an internal code, Ghost Charlie, a half-joking, half-wary label, a potential unidentified target, a ghost with no intel, because for some unspoken reason, he made them uneasy. Maybe because he felt no fear, maybe because he needed no one, or simply because he didn't belong here. He once tried the downtown cafe. Only once. He ordered an iced black coffee, sat in the far corner, and said nothing. The barista came over after a few minutes, apologized, and said the machine had broken. JT never returned, not because the coffee tasted bad, but because of the glances from those who had sat near him, looks that said his presence was something wrong. People usually like old storytellers, or at least those who can offer a gentle smile. JT told no stories. He didn't smile. He passed by like the January wind, making no sound, yet giving people chills. He neither confirmed nor denied who he once was. He carried no veteran's ID, flaunted no youthful photographs. All traces of his past lay in the way he walked, straight, slow but steady, as if each step was a test he knew all too well. Some said he'd been a sailor. Others said he'd served time in prison. No one knew for sure, but everyone had a reason never to ask. And as people often do with what they don't understand, they labeled him. To them, JT was strange, under surveillance, keep away. Yet no one wondered, if he truly was Ghost Charlie, then where had he come from? And if he was a ghost, what had killed him?
Welcome to Veteran Hero Medal, where silent scars speak, honor lives on, and real heroes wear no capes.
There are things that need no introduction, only presence. With JT, it was his right hand. Whenever he rolled back the sleeve of his coat, a flash of worn silver gleamed, neither brilliant nor polished like a wedding ring, but muted and battle-hardened. A silver ring, its surface scuffed as if it had struck stone, sand, and molten metal. At its center was an anchor entwined by a serpent, encircled by the emblem of SEAL Team 4, the Special Operations Unit once deployed on missions most Americans only heard of in vague defense bulletins. It wasn't jewelry. It was the only thing he wore. Most of the time, people didn't notice. But one day at the post office, a retired Marine standing behind him in line did. The Marine paused, nodded respectfully, and said nothing. JT did not respond. They didn't need to. For those who survived nameless missions together, one look was enough. On his boots caked with mud and winter slush was a small inscription on the heel, "Hope Enduring Freedom." Any veteran would recognize it immediately. Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan, scorching sands and nights unmarked by the names of the fallen. JT never spoke of the war, but those traces never left him. They simply didn't require display. On the rare occasion he sat in a bakery, a young student accidentally dropped her phone at his feet. As she bent to retrieve it, she paused for a second. Her gaze flicked over his snow-dusted boots and scuffed silver ring, then quietly moved to his weathered face. She offered an awkward smile, whispered thanks, and left, but from that day on, she placed an extra pastry beside the coffee he ordered. No note, no label, just a pastry. And he never touched it. Some might ask, why doesn't he say he was a SEAL? But that's a question only those who've never served would ask. A person entrusted with comrades' lives, who sat in a helicopter on a pitch-black night, knows that titles save no one, and sometimes silence is the only way to keep something intact within the soul. To JT, the ring was a wordless reminder, and those boots, though old, bore the footsteps of someone who'd overcome what the world called an impossible mission. Only one thing felt off to people. He never attended memorial events. No flags, no cemeteries, no veteran gatherings. When others convened to share old stories, he chose to walk a little further away, steering clear of streets draped in red and white banners. It seemed his homecoming was not to America, but to some realm of memory that only he remembered clearly. No one ever saw him cry. But once, on Thanksgiving, the bakery owner placed a small flag on the counter. When he walked in and saw it, he stopped and didn't step inside. His eyes seemed to search memories, then he quietly backed away through the door, no words, no sound. Sometimes the past needs no telling. It's etched on a person like gunpowder dust clinging to cloth. And JT, with his silver ring and worn boots, carried a time no one else could see, but those perceptive enough could feel. But if the past can't remain hidden forever, what happens when someone tries to tear that curtain away by force? Stay tuned. That morning, the air was colder than usual. Last night's snowfall hadn't fully melted, but the sunlight glistening on the wet pavement lent a sense of clarity. JT sat on his familiar bench in front of the bakery, as he did every Saturday morning. He held the local newspaper folded in half, his eyes scanning the small headlines, partly to read, partly to keep his hands and mind occupied. He liked that spot, not too close to the bakery door to be obtrusive, yet not so far that he'd disappear into the street, just close enough to hear the door's tinkling bell with each customer's entry and the sweet aroma of fresh pastries drifting out the crack. He didn't need anything more. But the world seemed to think otherwise. A Fort Collins patrol car pulled up just a few steps from the bench. A young officer stepped out, tall and lean, crew-cut hair, sunglasses reflecting the snowy ground. He didn't hurry, but each stride carried intent, and the atmosphere suddenly sagged, as though a cloud had formed in an otherwise clear sky. Joshua Mendenhall, 34, had a reputation for cracking down on anything that doesn't fit the safe profile. He saw JT, an older black man, sitting alone for no obvious reason. To him, that was cause for inquiry. "What are you doing here?" His question held no greeting. He slowly lifted his head and gently folded his newspaper. There was no challenge in his eyes, but no fear either. "I'm just reading the paper." No raised voices, no aggression. Yet as Mendenhall's hand tightened around his duty belt, passers-by began to notice. "Do you have identification? Driver's license? ID?" ID did not answer immediately. He laid the paper on his lap, as if weighing what was truly happening. It was a brief moment, but long enough to make the officer squint. "I need to check. You're making me uncomfortable." No one spoke aloud, but several inside the bakery pulled out their phones. Maybe instinct. Maybe because they'd seen too many online videos with unhappy endings. Mendenhall approached, his right hand hovering over his flashlight, his left hand reaching to tap JT's shoulder, signaling him to stand. But JT did not move. Not out of stubbornness, but as if he'd grown accustomed to being misunderstood. He remained seated, gaze unwavering on the officer, not defiant, simply unyielding. Then the inevitable happened. Mendenhall placed both hands on JT's shoulders, pressing down as if to subdue him. The bench scraped against the snow, and like an invisible signal, at least 7 phones were raised. No shouts. No one intervened, but their eyes were glued to every movement. The crowd's silence then weighed heavier than any siren. A young woman pushing the bakery door froze mid-step. A father laid a hand on his son's shoulder, pulling him back inside. Across the street, a retired firefighter set his coffee down, staring at the detained man as though he just recognized something he could hardly believe. Because those boots, that ring, and the way he showed no fear, could not belong to an ordinary man. Can you guess what happens next? Relax, leave a 1, or comment, "I'm still here," to keep listening. That silence, the moment when the entire space froze between 2 breaths, lasted only a few seconds. But for JT, it felt longer than a nighttime withdrawal under fire. Longer than the whir of a helicopter that never came. Longer than the span between life and death in a sand-choked alley in eastern Afghanistan. Joshua Mendenhall, still too young to understand that silence has a voice, pressed his hand into JT's chest. Not forcefully, but enough to trigger something in the crowd. And it surfaced not in shouts, but as a hoarse whisper from a shadowed corner behind the coffee cart. "He kicked down the door to save me from that Taliban hideout." The words were quiet, but they exploded across the silent street. The speaker was a gray-haired man in a leather jacket, his shoulder tilted from a bullet wound. He gave no introduction, made no move to push forward. He simply stood, eyes fixed on JT, as though reuniting with a fragment of memory. Some turned to stare, Others watched as the ripple moved through the onlookers. An elderly woman whispered, "Is that true?" The gray-haired man stepped forward and drew from his inner pocket a small leather case, a faded military ID. Thacker Jerome, SEAL Team 4, OP, Dust Storm. And then everything changed. Someone in the crowd quickly looked up references on their phone. Within seconds, a grainy archival photo appeared, a night shot of 9 soldiers standing in desert sand, arms draped over each other's shoulders. One figure was gaunt, wearing a beanie emblazoned with a Navy emblem, the only one not smiling, but whose eyes glowed like a watchlight in the dark. It was JT. "That was in Paktika," the teammate continued, his tone as steady as recounting a film etched on his mind. "They'd booby-trapped the only exit, and the helicopter couldn't turn back. He left no one behind. One by one, he carried us out. We lost 2 men, but the rest of us lived because of him." At that moment, the young officer's hand fell away from JT's shoulder, not because of orders, but because truth had peeled away every layer of prejudice from his eyes. No fanfare, no apology spoken. Yet the atmosphere had shifted. JT remained still as ever. He said nothing. He didn't look at Mendenhall. Perhaps he knew words were unnecessary now. A little boy slipped his hand from his father's coat pocket and quietly approached, holding a tiny American flag he'd brought from class the week before. Without a word, he held it out. JT studied him for a moment, then accepted the flag. His aged, calloused hand closed gently around it, not as a symbol, but as a memory returned. Someone began to clap. Not loudly, not in rhythm, but genuine applause, not for celebration, but for recognition. Then another joined in. And suddenly that frosty morning air felt warm, not by the sun, but by a truth brought into the light. And Mendenhall? He stood silently, lowering his hand, staring at the man before him, no longer seeing a potential risk, but a presence that made him reevaluate every definition he'd held of a suspicious person. My dear audience, stay tuned for the next part that will leave you in awe. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see people joining us from all around the world. News doesn't need sirens to travel far. It only needs a phone, or in this case, 7 phones, from 7 different angles, all capturing the moment a veteran was shoved against a wall for reading a newspaper. Less than 6 hours later, the video spread like a midsummer wildfire. From Twitter to Reddit, from the Fort Collins residents' Facebook group to a journalism student's TikTok account, the image of JT standing still, shoulders braced under the young officer's grip, his eyes holding that indefinable stare, was everywhere. People shared it not out of shock, but out of shame. The Fort Collins Police Department was forced to issue a statement. Joshua Mendenhall has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation for using unnecessary force on a non-threatening citizen. In bureaucratese, that means we were wrong, but we're still saving face. But the community didn't wait for the official report. They took action themselves. Local veterans immediately confirmed J.T. Thacker is living history that they had forgotten. Within 12 hours, a wave of posts shared old photos, training manuals, service certificates, and first-hand accounts only those who had lived in the trenches could truly understand. A retired Marine doctor from El Paso recounted the dust storm mission in Paktika province, where the SEAL team was pinned in a ring of fire, and only one man escaped to call in support before returning to carry each teammate to safety. That man was Thacker, Reporters from the Denver Post uncovered the 2004 mission dossier. The report read, Thacker led the team out of an illegally mined zone under sustained artillery fire, bringing every member out safely. No heroic flourish was needed. The action spoke for itself. The neighborhood where the incident occurred felt a shift in the air for days. A handwritten note appeared taped to the bakery door. Mr. Thacker, we apologize for letting you sit here alone all this time. No signature, none required. A young couple pinned a grainy newspaper clipping to the community bulletin board, scrawled beneath it, Do you know who the hero sitting in front of our bakery is? And then something no one expected. The Fort Collins School District organized a special lesson about community veterans. They began with one line, His name is Jerome Thacker. And here's what we overlooked. Local television crews arrived to interview him. He declined. A neighbor said, I asked if he'd seen the news. He told me I only watch the weather, so I know if I need a coat tomorrow morning. No further words needed. The past had spoken, and the community, in that rare moment, united around one truth. Not everyone in uniform is a hero, and not everyone who takes it off loses their worth. Because when we forget the man who kicked down the door to save lives, we lose more than a person. We lose one of our country's finest memories. Can that memory heal the silent wounds left behind? And what symbol will stand as the final testament to true recognition? Stay tuned for the concluding chapter. That afternoon, snow fell lightly, as though the sky itself wanted to make amends. Everything grew quiet, not from cold, but because something within people had softened. The bench in front of the bakery, the seat once deemed unfit for urban culture, was occupied again. JT returned, as if he'd never left, still in his worn coat, scuffed boots, and the faded navy beanie dusted with fresh snow. But today, something was different. Not in him, but in the way people looked at him. An elderly couple approached, hands holding steaming mugs of cocoa. They said nothing, asked nothing. They simply offered the drinks, then gently sat on the bench beside him, as though sharing the air was a way to say thanks. A 10-year-old boy hovered behind them, eyes equal parts curious and shy. Leaning toward his father, he whispered what should have been a secret, but the wind carried every word. Is he really a SEAL? The father did not answer at once. He studied JT, noted the shoulders no longer, as broad as in youth, yet still carrying a posture few could match. Then he nodded softly, gazing, never leaving the man before him. And the only one who stood firm today, even after being pushed. No banners, no chorus. Yet on that small Fort Collins street, the image of a veteran seated in white snow, cradling a mug of cocoa, became the symbol of truth restored. A distant television crew parked far away, making no move to interview him. They simply aimed their camera from a respectful distance, perhaps understanding that some people should only be recorded, not disrupted. The bakery owner quietly placed a small sign behind the glass door. Reserved for JT. No discussion followed, but everyone left that bench empty unless he was sitting there, and something remarkable happened afterward. Over the next week, dozens of letters arrived at the paper recounting times they'd seen JT help without fanfare. Once he'd guided an elderly lady across a flickering crosswalk. Another time he'd pushed a cart for a single mother carrying a crying baby. No one knew his name then, but now they remembered. Because memory, when awakened rightly, can become a beacon illuminating all we once forgot. Late afternoon, the snow ceased. The sun cast a golden orange glow over the damp pavement. On his faded beanie, The word Navy stood out as clear as ever, not because the snow had melted, but because the world's gaze had changed. A hero doesn't need a podium. He needs no accolades. He simply sits where he was once pushed and is embraced as part of the community he silently protected, and that is enough. Sometimes the greatest among us sit quietly beside us, needing no spotlight, no title, only a bench, a newspaper, and unwavering steadfastness. The story of J.T. Thacker is not just about a misunderstood veteran. It holds up a mirror to how easily our society forgets what truly matters. Quiet sacrifice, steadfast loyalty, and unassuming dignity. If today you've ever passed someone like him without pausing to see, remember, gratitude needs no holiday, only a heart that still feels. Share this story if you believe that people like JT deserve to be remembered. Don't forget to leave a comment below. Have you ever met a JT in your life? Like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss the stories that touch the best parts of all of us. Thank you for listening. And please remember, sometimes heroes wear knit caps, not crowns.